everyone. This is episode, I believe, 24. 24. Can't believe that we made it this far. In our discussion of rock history, again, this is Mr. E, the Bearded Music Teacher podcast. And this is an educational podcast of a brief summation of rock history into a small chunk podcast for my students. This podcast isn't exclusively for my students. If there's people out there that want to listen to it, by all means, go right ahead and do so. I am here in my classroom again. I love, like I said in the previous episode, I love being in my class. You can follow me at Twitter or on Twitter at MR_E_musicFCS. So if you want to, go ahead and follow me. That's where I post music facts, things that are happening in my classroom. Ideas of what's happening in my classroom, not necessarily things that are actually happening in my classroom. But this, again, is just a brief summary today. If you're watching on the YouTube side of things, we're talking about the Yardbirds. If you looked at the podcast, the audio version of it, we are looking at the title, The Yardbirds. Now, this is where things get, we're going to be just very short episodes. There's not a lot that I cover on these guys. I mainly spend, when it comes to Beatlemania, my unit on Beatlesmania, I normally spend the most time on the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. That's not to say that the Yardbirds and other bands like Dave Clark 5 and the Animals and things like that, the Kinks, the Who, things like that, it's not to say that they're not important. It's to say that that's where my focus lies. A lot of students really don't know a lot about the other bands, and so I just kind of focus more on the ones that they are more, the bigger ones, I feel. So today is the Yardbirds. The Yardbirds actually set up for an amazing group called Led Zeppelin later on. We'll get to that. The group initially consisted of Keith on vocals and harmonica, Paul Samuel Smith on bass, Jim McCarty on drums, Chris and Tony on guitar, and there's like a revolving door with those. But Tony was soon replaced by Eric Clapton. Eric Clapton, again, is a huge blues player, and as a matter of fact, the reason why we're going to kind of jump ahead for a second, the reason why Eric Clapton left is because he felt that the band, the Yardbirds, were kind of becoming too pop-oriented. So the Yardbirds developed long improvisation passages at the end of their songs that they called rev-ups. And this is a very important connection to the psychedelia with the Grateful Dead and other bands that would be seen at that time very marketable toward the FM radio side of things. We talk about FM radio in Unit 6 of my studies, where we talk about how, we actually just talked about it in one of my classes, that FM radio was really the place where the longer format singles that weren't really marketable in AM radio, where we would see things currently in our discussions, they kind of jumped to FM because that's where the format of a longer play is more welcomed. So the rev-ups really emphasize the virtuosity, the skill, if you would, the instrumental prowess that Eric Clapton especially had. He would go on these huge jam cycles where they would just jam, and it would be the startings of what became later on in rock music. It was great music, and even when they were live, they'd even go on for even longer than recorded, for what I've been told. The band's first 2 UK singles did not do great at all. I Wish You Would failed to even chart. Good Morning Little Schoolgirl rose only to number 44. So it wasn't even a top 20, top 50, or barely saw the top 50. That wasn't that great in the way of a singles thing. So after For Your Love was finished, which is one of their bigger breakout hits, the guitarist left the Yardbirds to join John Mayall and the Blues Breakers. So we have this kind of exiting of things, and I believe this is where Jeff Beck comes into place. Comes into play. Now I could be wrong. Um, the Yardbirds aren't exactly my big expertise, but the Yardbirds rose to number 6, that single, For Your Love, to number 6 in the United States, number 3 in the UK, and I believe that's where Beck actually made his like big splash, because he did replace Eric Clapton on guitar. And what came with Beck was the fuzz tone. His use of the fuzz tone to create these distinctive licks um, definitely influenced what we talked about in the last podcast with Keith Richards and that Satisfaction lick. If you don't know what I'm talking about, please go look it up. I don't want publishing companies to come after me for kind of humming the tunes, but I would definitely say go to Satisfaction by Rolling Stones and then look at Jeff Beck's stuff from the Yardbirds. There's definitely influence there with their sound, not the riffs, I would say, although there probably is a lot there with the riffs, but I would definitely say the tone aspect. This is where we get into the nuances of guitar playing, where the way we have things set up on a pedal, the tone knob, the volume, the drive, the EQs, if there's an EQ band on there, that if you have like one, I remember a couple pedals that I had from Digitech way back in the day, although I think they still do make pedals, but you can set certain bands high, mid, and low to drive a little bit further in the amp through the pedal and bring out those. But that's what we call the tone. But the fuzz tone, again, in the last discussion, to me, it's an overdrive, like distortion, because it is distorting the signal, but it's different. It's hard for me to describe. It's very different. It's very unique. As to me, it kind of sets itself in a subcategory with those distortions. Fuzz is one of those separate things that I feel. But of course, this is a bass player. I'm mainly a bass player now, so whatever. So there's another switch in in the lineup. It seemed like they could never really keep a main lineup. So this is where we get a little crazy. In the spring of '66, Simon Napier Bell and Paul Samwell Smith took over the production duties, and that resulted in the band's last hit, Over, Under, Sideways, Down. This is where things kind of fall apart. In June, Samwell Smith left the band to devote himself to producing, and session guitar Jimmy Page was brought in. This is where Jimmy Page is brought in that kind of turns it toward kind of cheating out, spoiler alert, to Led Zeppelin. Page initially played bass. Page is known for a very, anything with strings. The guy is a great fretted string player. But it was the fall of Chris. By the fall, Chris, that was on bass originally, if I remember correctly. No, on guitar. They switched him out of bass, leaving Beck and Page. So they had Chris swap out. He left to go to bass on the Yardbirds. So then Beck and Page filled in to share 2 lead guitar spots, which is something very unique. And I would venture to say that it was something that kind of influenced maybe Judas Priest's lineup with Rob Halford on lead vocals. He talks about the driving guitars in his book, if I remember correctly. So that might be a little bit of a connection there. So Page and Beck take share the spot as the lead guitarist. They go back and forth between lead lines, and then Beck leaves to form Jeff Beck Group, while Page, Chris, Keith, and Jim all kept on with the Yardbirds until the summer of '68 when they disbanded. And this is really weird because Page formed a new group fulfilling the remaining dates of the Yardbirds had already booked. They kind of disbanded in the middle of a tour. I wouldn't say a full-out tour, but they already had gigs still lined up. And Page, for a little bit of time, the Yardbirds were known as the New Yardbirds, and Page brought people in, and then they booked as Led Zeppelin, and then of course um, you have Peter Grant that takes over. He's already there, kind of for the Yardbirds already with Jimmy Page toward the end of this, and Peter Grant that goes and takes on a lot of the bookings solely as like the Led Zeppelin handler. And Led Zeppelin goes off to do a lot of great things. Specifically, everyone knows is the forbidden riff in Guitar Store's Stairway to Heaven. But the Yardbirds kind of creep under the radar for a lot of music history until they get to Led Zeppelin. A lot of people, novice music historians, like novice kind of rock fans, they don't exactly make the connection. It's like, yeah, there was a band before Led Zeppelin. It's called the Yardbirds, and it does definitely have a lot of connections with their blues kind of orientation. Led Zeppelin, though, after it turned from Yardbirds to Led Zeppelin, with Jimmy Page really, I feel Jimmy Page really leading the creativity side of things, along with Robert Plant. Those two become very, very close. And of course, I believe you have Bonzo on the drums. I could be wrong. Again, Led Zeppelin is not my expertise, but if you look at Led Zeppelin albums, it's far different, I feel, from the Yardbirds. Yardbirds are more blues oriented, and then as they start getting into, again, they disbanded. The Yardbirds disbanded in '68. So right around the time where music is starting to become very, very experimental in the way of rock and very avant-garde type stuff, Led Zeppelin comes in and they really, really take it to another level. If you look at the handful of albums that Led Zeppelin puts out, there is a vast contrast between albums as well as in between each cut of the album. So that really kind of sums up the Yardbirds. They kind of show up for about just for the middle part of the decade, really. Probably right around shortly after, at least in the limelight, shortly after the Beatlemania. They were around before that, though. I would say they are around before Beatlemania comes in. It's not like they just created a group, but they are known. I would say they fall more along the lines of the Rolling Stones camp with the blues influence, and we talk about that in class, where it is the British invasion usually falls under two categories. We talk about either they're a Beatles type band or a Stones type band, and the Beatles are more vocal oriented, more poppy kind of stuff, while the blues are more the Stones kind of thing. And I would say the Yardbirds are more the blues. When you definitely take a look at the people who are in that group, with the harmonica, with the vocals, the instrumentation alone, combined with what the artists in the Yardbirds specifically do, both in the Yardbirds and after the Yardbirds, it's blues oriented. So that sums up the Yardbirds episode. There are some great books on the Yardbirds, specifically Led Zeppelin, because that's the main focus with Jimmy Page, of course. Please make sure you check that out. Please make sure you check out Over, Under, Sideways, and Down, or Over, Under, Sideways, Down, as well as For Your Love. For Your Love is another one that I really hit with my students. That is really good. It's an interesting track. It sets up, if I remember correctly, it's a contrasting verse chorus form. I could be wrong, but it's definitely one of those things that it is a huge landmark, one of those landmark pieces in this area of music that isn't Beatles and Stones. So that is it for today. Please make sure you share my podcast. Please make sure that you follow me on Twitter. Again, it's at MR_E_musicFCS. And we'll see you next time, where we'll discuss actually two bands, the Kinks and the Who.